I think we've seen two major long-term trends begin to come to fruition. One of these trends is the redistribution of economic and political power that we're seeing in the international system, and that is, in particular, we're seeing the relative decline in the United States, and we're seeing the rise of new, particularly Asian powers such as China and India. At the same time, we're seeing another trend which is even more significant, which is really what might be described as deepening globalization, the process by which technology is making the world a much smaller place. In the last 2 decades, we've seen email, fax machines, mobile telephones, and what that has effectively done has transformed our methods of communications. Now, at first, when this process got underway, everybody thought globalization was just synonymous with corporations, moving market money around the world. But what now becomes apparent, particularly in 2011, is that we're seeing, if you like, the emergence of the rising power of international civil society. People communicating within societies who have like-minded agendas. They may be protesting against an authoritarian regime, but also people who can now begin to act internationally. That is, people who use this new forms of communication to mount common protests. So we are actually at the beginning, I think, of a major shift in global politics.
So could it be said that we've simply been given the technology to express what we've long felt?
Well, there is an element of that, but you know, you and I may have a particular view about a subject, but if we think we can't do anything about it, we may just keep that view to ourselves. Now, I think the technology enables people to not only express their views, but also to organise with like-minded people. And one of the things we've seen, particularly in the Arab world, but also we're beginning to see in Russia, and also we're seeing in the Western world with the Occupy Wall Street movement, is that people are actually beginning to become emboldened by this technology and to no longer to accept things which they were previously prepared to accept.
It is a great risk for some people, isn't it? For the residents of some nations to actually stand up against the powers that be. Many lives have been lost. It's a great risk for them, isn't it?
It is, but I think what we can infer from that is that their existing situation is truly desperate. And we often, particularly in New Zealand, where we have a relatively affluent society, of course we have, you know, people who are poor here as well, but it's a difference in scale. If you're looking at a society like Egypt, for example, where there's absolute poverty, that is, a large number of people live on less than $2 US dollars a day, those people are prepared to take risks. And we're seeing this in Syria, where people are protesting even to the point of risking their own lives. And more than 3,500 people have died in Syria protesting against the regime, often completely defenceless. So I think what you may say is that there's also an element of desperation combined with apparently the means to mobilise like-minded people.
Does the rise in protests bring a new set of dangers? Is the world becoming a more unstable place because of it?
I think it's unstable in the short term, but it also perhaps increases the pressure to resolve long-standing problems. Let me give you one long-standing problem. That is the growing inequality that's occurred within the world. Now, in the post-Cold War era, we've seen an ever-increasing potential to create wealth, and yet that has not been matched by the ability to more fairly distribute that wealth. If you look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, they call themselves the 99%ers. That is 99% of the American population which are not millionaires or billionaires. And so what people are demanding, if you like, is that they want not an overthrow of capitalism, but they don't want crony capitalism, they want mass capitalism. They want a slice of the action. They want greater equality, not absolute equality, but a greater opportunity. Because there's no doubt about it, we do live in a world which is having the potential to create ever more wealth, and yet we're seeing the wealth concentrated in ever fewer hands. And that is creating a tension that has to be resolved.
Well, the protests in Europe and in Russia, and especially in the Arab countries now, it seems so far away. But what implications do they bring for us here in New Zealand?
Well, I don't think, I mean, geographically, of course, it does seem far away. But I think there are very real implications. We've seen, for example, that if we neglect issues of perceived injustice in the Middle East, that can have consequences. For example, it can encourage people to take up terrorism. And that in turn can affect our vital interests. And one thing we should never forget about New Zealand, it may be small, although it's not a small country, of course, in terms of its land space, it's small in terms of population, but it's also a global actor. It is also a country which depends on its living for selling what it produces abroad, particularly agricultural products. So New Zealand has a big stake in a stable international order in order for us to make our living in the world. So it's very important. Our connection with these events is actually more tangible than we often realise. If the world degenerated into chaos, we would stand to lose quite substantially from that development.